All right, now tell me about these skateboarders.
Yeah,
or
what I
whatever.
was saying is, it's these guys it's called Shy Guy Seeps or Shy Guys Eeps. I don't really know. But dude, these guys are, God, I mean, they're insane. They like go down these massive, like in the middle, like the video that I just sent you, there is this dude on a skateboard and he's just, I mean, he's probably going 60 miles an hour, literally down like a hill, like you would think of in like San Francisco, in the middle of the rain, with leaves all over the road, and just fearless. And then you start thinking, wait a minute, how am I seeing this? And then you see the cameraman who's doing the exact same thing, turn the camera on himself.
Dude,
It's just like,
that stuff's crazy, man. Like, I mean, do you remember like whenever you'd go down a hill?
oh, the shakes.
When you were a kid, and that thing starts
Yeah.
wobbling back and forth, you get the wobbles.
Oh, yeah.
And you're like, oh man, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Bail. And you just like, the first time you do that, you don't realize, you in your mind, you think, okay, basically when I jump off the skateboard,
I'll be fine.
it'll just be I'll land on the ground. That's it. But you don't understand physics yet. And so when you jump, you don't realize that all that momentum you had traveling on the skateboard,
Oh, yeah.
you can't just come to a complete stop and then you just bite the pavement.
Yeah, I also had a little story when I was a kid. So we lived, I mean, I feel like I haven't said this in a while, but it's almost a drinking game at this point. But I lived in a rural area, and my cousin had a four-wheeler that he brought over to the house, and I was like really big into skateboarding at the time. And it was like, oh man, why have we never thought of this? I'm just going to hang on to a dog chain tied around the four-wheeler. And I kept, because it was like a dog chain, so we tried it a few times. Because it was a dog chain, it kept kind of like slipping out of my hand. So I was like, oh, I got this. I'm going to pull my sleeve down. Then I'm going to wrap the dog chain around my wrist so I can't let go. So...
Safety
first. Safety first. I'm getting a little more courageous, So he just hauls it, just guns it on the four-wheeler, and everything's cool. We're, that little stretch between my house and then the top of my hill to my grandmother's house. Mm-hmm. We're just hauling it, and all of a sudden, which is what I would imagine would happen to these guys eventually, my skateboard hit a little tiny pebble.
That's all.
And
I
go flying in the air, and I'm still connected to the four-wheeler. And so it literally, I slam into the ground, and it's like, I mean, it was probably, I don't know, it's probably only like 2, 3, 4 seconds before he realized it and then stopped the four-wheeler. But that was me dragging like both of my hands against the pavement for like 3 or 4 seconds, and just road rash, man. Tough.
Man, I don't know why we're in the skateboarding mood, but I mean, you remember that movie Thrashing?
Oh, yeah. It's been a while, but yeah.
The best, man. So good.
Oh, what about Gleaming the Cube?
Yeah, Gleaming the Cube.
That was another good one.
Christian Slater, and of course, Tony Hawk makes an appearance in that
Oh,
movie.
yeah. And that was the one at the end when he gets like the really badass, like all black skateboard, right? Was that the one I'm thinking of?
Maybe, man. I don't know.
He gets like all black, like pads, and like the skateboard's all like matte black with black wheels.
Isn't it cool that like the 80s made helmets and elbow and knee pads like cool?
I mean, not really helmets per se, but...
No, dude. I mean, like you got to go back and watch like Thrashing. You know, the guys that were like on those vert ramps, half pipes and stuff like that, man. In the competitions, you had to have.
Oh,
them.
yeah.
So it was just like, oh yeah, cool, man. I got to get one of those, and you can put like cool stickers on it.
Yeah.
know?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I guess so. I guess now that you said like all the stickers on it, I do remember that was pretty cool. All right, well, are we getting started, Bill?
Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Abominable Snowman, Yeti, Yirin, Yowie, Saqueatl, Sesquak, or even Orang Pendek. The details and names may differ slightly from place to place, but from North America to China, all the way to New Zealand and even Indonesia, there is one thing for certain. Something is out there. Whether they're described as being chocolate brown, white as a snowy blizzard, or even black as night, these hair-covered, upright standing creatures have been encountered and talked about across the globe for more than 600 years. There are endless interesting and intriguing encounters, but today we rewind the clock back to the summer of 1924. When a group of gold prospectors near Mount St. Helens in southern Washington named Fred Beck, Gabe Lefevre, John Peterson, Marion Smith, and Smith's son Roy described coming upon and being attacked by guerrilla men near where they had built a small cabin for their gold hunting. Here are Fred Beck's own words describing the event, in which he later recalled in a short book he wrote about the encounter called I Fought the Ape-Men of Mount St. Helens. We had been prospecting for 6 years in the Mount St. Helens and Lewis River area in southwest Washington. We had from time to time come across large tracks by creek beds and springs. In 1924, I and 4 other miners were working our gold claim, the Vander White. It was 2 miles east of Mount St. Helens near a deep canyon now named Ape Canyon, which was so named after our encounter reached the newspapers. Hank, a great hunter and good woodsman, was always a little apprehensive after seeing these tracks. The tracks were large, and we knew that no animal could have made them, the largest measuring 19 inches long. It was in the middle of July, and we had received a good assay on our claim, and everyone was excited. I remember I had a tooth that was aching, and I suggested to Hank that he should take me down to see a dentist, but he was so enthused in the prospects of the gold mine, he barely took time to answer me. He replied that God or the devil could not get him away from there. We had all come up in his Ford, and I had no way to get to town unless he took me. So when we went back to our cabin on the north side of the canyon, I had a nagging toothache and little appetite for our evening meal of beans and hotcakes. We had been hearing noises in the evening for about a week. We heard a shrill, peculiar whistling each evening. We would hear it coming from one ridge, and then hear an answering whistling from another ridge. We also heard a sound which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound, just like something was hitting itself on its chest. Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring about 100 yards from our cabin to get some water, and suggested we take our rifles to be on the safe side. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle. At that instant, I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away, on the other side of a little canyon standing by a pine tree. It dodged behind the tree and poked its head out from the side of the tree. And at the same time, Hank shot. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall with blackish brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time. But then we saw it, running fast and upright about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view. We took the water back to the cabin and explained the affair to the rest of the party, and we all agreed, including Hank, to go home the next morning, as it would be dark before we could get to the car. We agreed it would be unsound to be caught by darkness on the way out. Nightfall found us in our pine log cabin. We had built the cabin ourselves and had made it very sturdy. In the cabin, we had a long bunk bed in which 2 could sleep feet to feet. The rest of us, though, sleeping on pine boughs on the floor. At one end of the cabin, we had a fireplace fashioned out of rocks. There were no windows in the cabin, so darkness found all of us in the cabin. I was more calm now, and my tooth was better. Somehow the excitement seemed to work a temporary cure on it. We were sitting around, puffing on pipes, and talking about the trip home the next day. Each of us settled down in his crude but welcomed bed and soon fell asleep. About midnight, we were all awakened. Hank, who was sleeping on the floor, was yelling and kicking. But the noise that had awakened us was a tremendous thud against the cabin wall. Some of the chinking had been knocked loose from behind the logs and had fell across Hank's chest. He had his rifle in his hand and was waving it back and forth as he kicked and yelled. I helped to get the chinking off of him, and he jumped to his feet. Then, we heard a great commotion outside. It sounded like a great number of feet trampling and rattling over a pile of our unused shakes. We grabbed our guns. Hank squinted through the space left by the chinking. By actual account, we saw only 3 of the creatures together at one time, but it sounded like there were many more. They hurled many small rocks and stones at the cabin, but they did not break through the roof. Some did fall through the chimney of the fireplace. The only time we shot our guns that night was when the creatures were attacking our cabin. When they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. I told the rest of the party that maybe if they saw we were only shooting when they attacked, they might realize we were only defending ourselves. We did shoot, however, when they climbed up on our roof. We shot round after round through the roof. We had to brace the hewed log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed. The creatures were pushing against it, and the whole door vibrated from the impact. We responded by firing many more rounds through the door. They pushed against the walls of the cabin as if trying to push the cabin over. Hank and I did most of the shooting. The rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin, guns in their hands. The attack continued the remainder of the night, with only short intervals in between. A most profound and frightening experience occurred when one of the creatures, being close to the cabin, reached an arm through the chinking space and seized one of our axes by the handle. Before the thing could pull the axe out, I swiftly turned the head of the axe upright so it caught on the logs, and at the same time Hank shot, barely missing my hand. The creature let go and I pulled the handle back in. We put the axe in a safe place. The attack ended just before daylight. Just as soon as we were sure it was light enough to see, we came cautiously out of the cabin. It was not long before I saw one of the ape-like creatures standing about 80 yards away near the edge of Ape Canyon. It shot 3 times, and it toppled over the cliff down into the gorge, some 400 feet below. Then Hank said that we should get out of there as soon as possible. Not bother to pack our supplies or equipment. After all, he said, it's better to lose them than our lives. We were only too glad to agree. We brought out only that which we could get into our pack sacks. We left about $200 in supplies, powder, and drilling equipment behind. I tried to persuade everyone not to relate the happenings to anyone, and they agreed. But Hank soon let the cat out of the bag. We made our way to Spirit Lake, and Hank went into the ranger station. He had told the ranger earlier about the tracks, and the ranger had replied, "Let me know if you find out what they are." And that's just what Hank did. When we were back home in Kelso, Washington, he told some of his friends, and somehow the story leaked out to the papers, and the Great Hairy Ape Hunt of 1924 was on. The site of the cabin is no longer known, but Ape Canyon continues to be a popular hiking destination, despite being significantly altered by the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. And the legend of Fred Beck and his companions has lived on ever since. Although it's almost been 100 years since this encounter, if you ever find yourself in Ape Canyon, sightseeing, or looking for Bigfoot himself, you might want to make sure you come prepared.
Hey, all you cats and kittens, welcome back to That Would Be Rad, your favorite podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and raising our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s. I'm your host, Tyler Bence, and this is your other host,
Woody Brown.
Hey, man.
Quick question for you. So out of all the options we had, Harry and the Hendersons, campers and gold prospectors, you went for cats and kittens.
I mean, it just didn't feel right. And that was just, it was off the cuff, you know, it was like just a moment of inspiration. So I just went with it.
So this is it, man. This is the first Bigfoot episode.
Sure is. Long overdue, really. I mean,
Yeah, no, man. We talk about, all things paranormal, but we really kind of haven't really dove too heavy into that kind of stuff.
I think a lot of it.
Really.
So go ahead, sorry.
No, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I think a lot of it had to do with just, I don't know, maybe like a subconscious intimidation, maybe, just because it's, it's clearly like one of the topics that both of us are really into. Even though this particular incident is a little on the outskirts of, the heavy hitters, I don't know, it's still a topic that it came with some intimidation because there's a lot that we want to do right by our listeners and get a lot of it right and kick it off the way it should be kicked off.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different events. There's so many different, encounters and stuff with Bigfoot. And like you said, it's just one of those topics that it can very quickly, I don't know. I think what's kind of one of the reasons why we even chose not only this specific event to talk about, but also just kind of got us back into, man, we got to talk about Bigfoot, was several months ago when we went and visited the Bigfoot Museum here in Blue Ridge, Georgia.
Dude, I totally didn't even think about that.
That's where, okay, full disclosure here, I'm the one that's I'm the one of the podcast who basically is just now getting into or getting into things like Bigfoot and the cryptids and all that kind of stuff. Mainly fueled by, of course, you talking about it nonstop over the years, but also, an interest in other podcasts and stuff like that. So it's kind of refueled that interest, and little did I know that right here, just about, I don't know, man, what was it, like an hour and a half away from us?
Yeah, pretty close.
About an hour and a half away from us, there is this, legit Bigfoot
it's
museum.
Amazing, dude.
And, I mean, it totally exceeded our expectations, even from, looking at pictures online of the place and then actually going to it and checking it out. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, it was really cool. We had been trying to get out there for a long time because, it's a little ways away, but relatively close. And apparently there's a lot of people out there that they travel across the nation to come to this thing. So, because it's fairly local, at least me, I don't know about you, but I felt like it was a little, it was like, oh, this would be a cool little museum.
I just thought there was going to be pamphlets
and
me
too. Yeah.
Kind of local dude that was just like, now here in these here hills of Georgia, we got a big
yeah, exactly.
I didn't know what to expect.
I mean, somebody has sank some serious money into it because it's like top of the line.
Oh man, so amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of like a walkthrough sort of type museum. You're kind of led into these different rooms, and they have sort of the first room that you kind of go into is it's sort of set up like an office of like an investigator, So there's a lot of like sort of specimen, and there's a lot of, there's a 4-foot long scat, Bigfoot scat even. I don't know why I kicked off of that, but it's just like whoever put it together did a really, really great job.
Yeah, it's just super awesome. Going into that room too first was hilarious because, well, first off, you got these cool exhibits on that wall as you go in, and it's like a self-guided tour kind of scenario. And you walk in, and there's these really cool exhibits on the wall. A lot of them, some of them like from local finds in Georgia, but then others that we found later that were these artifacts and things that come from these famous encounters. But as we're like looking around the room, and there's also like pieces of this helicopter from a helicopter crash that happened, I think, in the 90s here in North Georgia. In North Georgia, there's an Army division, the Rangers. They have a base up in the North Georgia mountains. It's where they kind of train for their mountaineering.
Which is actually right by my old house where I grew up.
Yeah, and like survival skills and all kinds of stuff. And it's not too uncommon for us, even being south of that now, to see multiple sort of troop transports, helicopters flying over. And hey, if you turn up the volume loud enough, sometimes in the podcast you can probably hear them.
Yep.
But anyhow, one of their helicopters crashed in the 90s, and there's pieces of that helicopter. There was a Bigfoot encounter when that happened. So it's like, it's really, really cool that they have that. And then you kind of like, your eyes kind of follow along the wall, and then all of a sudden on the back wall is this gigantic like sculpture of a Bigfoot like family, just their heads. And one of them, and this is the funniest thing. I mean, we laughed, I don't even know how long, and I had immediately had to take a picture of this. There's this Bigfoot head that legit just looks like I'm staring straight in the mirror.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the funny thing about Woody and I is, we've been best friends for years, and we kind of have this thing that we do where we'll send these pictures to each other of these just like hideous people. We'll be like, hey man, I found a cool picture of you. And, but like this one actually really does look like Woody.
Man, yeah. I mean, I texted to my wife like right when we saw it, and she just laughed her butt off, and it was just so funny. And so I even texted to my parents and my brother, and I was like, hey man, I found my long lost origins here. So, but yeah, so you leave that room, you go into another one, and I won't give you a full play-by-play, but essentially every major Bigfoot encounter, they have just so much information.
And it's almost like a diorama, is that right?
Yeah,
like
I think so.
The Ape Canyon incident, for example, I had heard of it before, the Mount St. Helens incident, but Woody, I don't think you had even.
Yeah, I was not that familiar with it, man. And we come around the corner, and there's this.
It's like
there's
this
like reenactment
scene,
of the scene. And so I was like, Tyler, what is this? Because you see this like Bigfoot kind of coming into this cabin. So your perspective is kind of look as if you're inside the cabin.
Yeah.
You're seeing all these guys like kind of around this cabin,
like it's trying to get through the door.
Yeah, man. And this Bigfoot's like trying to come through the door. And I was like, dude, what is this? And you're like, oh yeah, that's Ape Canyon. And I started reading about it, and I thought, oh my gosh, dude, we have to talk about this on the podcast because one, it's terrifying, and two, it's just one of the situations that just stuck out of my head from the museum. It was like, man, it just looked amazing how they had it all set up. They also had one for, and I don't know what the name of it is. You probably do. The one where like the young kind of college-aged kids.
The Dyatlov Pass in Russia.
Yeah, so it had like a model of like this tent and all the footprints and stuff. And then we were also able to listen to
the Sierra Sounds.
Yeah, the Sierra Sounds, which I had never heard before. Yeah, and oh my god, man, it will literally put chills up your spine.
Yeah, it's one of the most fascinating. I mean, they're all really fascinating on their own, and I think it's cool because especially at the museum that they had a lot of the really sort of interesting ones. Like there's a phrase that Tim over at the Strange Familiars podcast uses called weird washing. It's kind of like whitewashing where. A lot of these stories, even the Ape Canyon incident, really you kind of have to dig to find a lot of the more sort of esoteric, a little sort of weird sort of bits of the story, but you know, like a lot of the stuff is sort of weird washed, which means they take away maybe they had a UFO sighting the same day, maybe they were seeing orbs, maybe they you know, saw an entity or a Bigfoot or whatever, and then it disappeared. You know, this stuff has gone hand in hand for years, and a lot of times, especially the guys who are very into, oh, well, it's an erect hominid, and it's some sort of descendant of Gigantopithecus, so it's basically just a monkey walking around. There's nothing else to it. The end. A lot of those guys tend to sort of weird wash it, where they take all that other stuff away. And I thought the cool thing about the museum is a lot of the accounts and a lot of the cases that they featured were some of the weirder kind of, you know, sort of incidents, which is really cool.
Yeah, they definitely didn't leave any detail kind of unturned, man. I mean, I was super impressed by all of the displays. And I mean, like you said, it's just like and it's probably an unfair assumption on my behalf. I mean, like sometimes people can think of like Bigfoot enthusiasts as, you know, kind of kooky people or something like that, you know, just like any of the paranormal type stuff. Sometimes that's just like this unfair assumption that people make. And I didn't assume that necessarily. I just didn't think it was going to be as good as it was, you know? I mean, it was just, I was extremely impressed. It's very cool. It's a destination that I highly recommend for anyone, not only that lives in Georgia, but, you know, anywhere you are. Come and check this museum out. It's very cool. The people that work there are very, very nice. And it's just a really, really neat, cool place to visit.
Yeah, and also I would venture to say, just because it's local, you know, fairly local for us, I would also sort of venture to say that I can't think of another, you know, museum that's dedicated to Bigfoot that would be even remotely close to being as nice and as put together. And I mean, it's amazing. It really is I mean, if you're even kind of into, you know, Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever, it's definitely worth the trip. Yeah, you'll totally enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, our ultimate goal is to take our friends from Bigfoot Collectors Club.
Yeah,
and once this pandemic thing's done, they fly out here and we take them up to the museum.
Oh yeah,
and
for sure,
that'd be really cool.
Yeah,
dude, we got to get into this Ape Canyon incident. I mean, well, there's a couple things. Let me ask you this: have you ever like been camping or whatever and just heard crazy stuff anyway? I mean,
oh yeah,
any of your I mean, like I've had like a handful of experiences where, you know, you hear crazy stuff in the middle of the night and you're like, your brain is trying to figure out, okay, is that an owl? Well, it doesn't really sound like an owl. I mean, the last time I went camping with my family, now keep in mind, my wife, first off, I'm an avid like camper. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail, not the whole thing, but, you know, segments of it. And my wife is, well, she's not really into camping, but I have convinced her that once a year, that me and she'll come with the kids and we'll go camping. So the first time we did that, of course, like I wanted everything to just work out perfectly because at this point I want to be able to convince her for future trips and to make it easier and her, you know, get into it and that kind of thing. So I've got it all planned out. I go, you know, whatever. And this is like several years ago, so the kids are even younger, which if I could make any advice to anybody with youngsters,
do
just
not
like, wait until they're at least like 5 or 6 before you take them. Because like our youngest was like 2. Oh man, it was a nightmare.
Yeah.
So in the middle of the night, we hear, I mean, especially now after hearing the Sierra sounds, I'm not sure what we heard. It wasn't an owl. It wasn't a dog. It was just something crazy as hell. And it was kind of like a far distance from us. But then we heard dogs kind of reacting to the sound. And so it was so loud that it like woke us all up. And of course, like she was 2 at the time. She starts like fussing, and we're like, "No, you got to be quiet," because we're trying to listen to see if this creature
Coming to you.
is coming to us,
Yeah.
you know. And it's like 2 a.m, and needless to say, we didn't really get a lot of rest that night. And long story short, my wife was like, "We're not going camping again until she is 5." You know.
Yeah.
So, anyways, like, imagine you and your buddies are on this expedition to go and get gold. You know, this is and even if nobody's ever been to like Oregon or Washington or that Pacific Northwest area, I mean, it's impressive. You know, if you are from Southern California and you've never been up that direction, or you're from Texas and you're used to like, you know, mesquite trees and stuff, or you're from Georgia and you're used to tall pines, all of that stuff pales in comparison to the wilderness and just the massive expanse of just humongous trees and wildlife and stuff that's out there, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so, like, if you can picture that scene in your head, you're just in the middle of this wilderness.
That's never
kind of
human eyes have never probably laid eyes on what you're seeing. That's the amazing part too. Is like, I think as you're painting a picture, it's good to realize too that, I mean, you know, even if you went out there now, you would have this. But I mean, this was back in 1924. This is long before the term Sasquatch. This is long before. I mean, granted, like the Indians and the natives of all over the country have, you know, stories of these, you know, these wild men, or you know, they would call them wild men back in the day. Yeah, I mean, 1924. So they're in an area that probably only they have ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, you walk into an area like that. I mean, that, number one, nowadays is such a unique experience to kind of even have, that it's one of the reasons why I kind of want to instill, you know, well, obviously respect for the wilderness, but also like venturing out into it, you know, with my kids, as long as you do it safely.
Yeah.
It's very neat. You're sometimes walking where, you know, humanity hasn't really, there's not a lot of high traffic there, you know? And so to experience that is just, it's phenomenal. And like, these guys are trying to make a living. They are trying to find gold. And then just being so kind of far away from town, you know, if some, you know, what hits the fan, I'm sure they weren't expecting just this barrage attack of these, what they consider to be ape-men, to happen. I mean, can you imagine just how terrifying that would be?
Well, and another interesting thing too is, you know, before all this went down, Fred Beck is kind of the central figure in this. He's the guy who kind of came out and started talking about it due to his son sort of trying to pull it out of him. And I think his son actually released the story in '67. You know, he had a really bad toothache, and he was trying to get back into town. And if you've ever had like a toothache, Thomas, I'm talking to you, our old drummer. If you've ever had a toothache, I mean, I don't care how tough you are. I mean, it can drop you, you know? So he was trying to get back, but they were so far out. And then one of the other dudes, you know, which is an interesting quote, one of the other guys said, neither God nor the devil could take me off this mountain, because you know, at the time they're mining for gold. So you kind of get that gold fever, you know? So he's like, I don't care if my friend's doubled over in pain from a toothache, you know, God or the devil can't take me away from this.
That was one of those lines that stuck out to me as well.
Another thing that, you know, from the story, I kind of did a little more digging into Fred Beck, and he was kind of an interesting character. And again, you know, going back to that phrase, weird washing, you know, a lot of this stuff was sort of lost to history unless you really kind of dig. So he was a guy that his whole life, he kind of claimed that he had, you know, spirit guides or angels, or he called them masters. You know, since he was a boy, even as a boy, he had lost a toy, and it had been lost for years, but was approached by a woman, which later he, you know, hindsight 2020, he looked back on as like, well, you know, maybe she was like a spirit guide. Maybe she wasn't even a real woman, but she said that he would find it again several years later, 3-4 years later, and exactly as she said, he ended up finding it. But it's really cool because the site that this was actually on, well, the area that it originally the area that they were at was called the Plains of Abraham, and the reason it's called Ape Canyon was because that's what, after they came out with the story, it was kind of renamed as Ape Canyon because of, they called it an ape-man because, it was a 7-foot tall, ape-man back in the day. And again, this is long before the term Sasquatch or Bigfoot or any of that had reached the zeitgeist of the American public, but he found this site because, again, he said that he had these spirit guides, and he said one of the names of his spirit guide that he had like throughout his whole life, and again, I don't know if this is something that he named this entity or whatever, or if, that's what it told him its name was, but apparently it was called Vandergriff White, and that was actually what he renamed the actual, the cabin and the site, the actual site of the incident and everything. And the way that he found that was, he said that a glowing arrow, as they were walking, through the woods to kind of find, I guess there were certain markers that miners would look for, for these veins of gold. But he said that a glowing arrow led him, to where they would find gold, and the arrow came out of a door that opened up in the sky. He also believed that the ape-men, he later said, and I think this was sort of in retrospect, after a few years of like sort of looking back on it, but it says that he believed the ape-men and UFOs, because that was another thing. He also saw several sort of lights in the sky, which later he would say were, UFOs, especially if this came out in 1967. This whole part of the story, that was the height of the UFO kind of craze. So, he said that he saw all these things, and he believed that the ape-men and UFOs were both interdimensional entities and could really only be seen if you had a higher level of consciousness. So it's really cool. And I like, I think a lot of people could look at that and think, well, he was a weirdo and he had all these sort of, crazy ideas and spirit guides and stuff. And it would sort of delegitimize his story. But to me, it kind of like even sort of solidifies the story a little, because again, this is back in 1924. And yeah, there's the spiritualist movement, was kind of heavy around that era. But some of the things that he said were definitely not of the times,
Well, and what's interesting to me too, man, is, and I think it's being on the East Coast here and having a little bit like a different Native American culture and lore and stuff that we experience. I think, maybe an interesting thought is like, I think maybe people out there in that Pacific Northwest, they're more accustomed to things like that, like spirit guides.
Oh,
and
yeah.
even kind of digging into that lore, and they'll have more experience with it just in their just sort of blended cultures.
Right.
And so it might not sound as crazy to them, but for us, like on the East Coast, and
this is Bible
in
Belt.
different areas of the country, it might be like, well, gosh, this guy's talking about aliens, interdimensional creatures, and Bigfoot. It kind of, it might be easy to kind of write him off, like you said, as like a crazy person. But it's funny because I never really knew or even associated any kind of connection. This is very new to me as well. So some of you listeners thinking, well, okay, this is about Bigfoot, and then all of a sudden now you hear Tyler talking about interdimensional creatures and
glowing
UFOs
arrows
and stuff. Yeah, and there is a faction, I guess, of belief and or just a kind of interest or study about the possibility that Bigfoot is an interdimensional or even maybe extraterrestrial kind of creature being, And so that's an interesting thing that before, I would say until the past 6 months or so, I had no I had no idea or prior experience to hearing anything about that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the thing that, and again, a lot of those, and it's the same in like the UFO community where, you know, you have your guys who are very, what they call like the nuts and bolts guys, where all UFOs are, you know, metallic structures with anti-gravitic or
Some sort of technology.
yeah, and electromagnetic, you know, or even sound or whatever. But like it's like, oh, these are tangible things that we can
Figure out, study.
yeah,
understand.
we can figure out, we can take and then back engineer, and they're all tangible things. And I think for the longest time, I think all of us probably come from that. And it's the same with Bigfoot, where you start your baseline, you start out as, you know, believing that, like, okay, well, Bigfoot, he's a corporeal, you know, remnant of Gigantopithecus. He's an ape, and maybe he is, but it is weird and it is fascinating. And this is the thing that like keeps me kind of coming back. I mean, I love the idea that I'm not opposed to the idea that it's like a relict hominid and it's a real live thing. But at the same time, once you kind of look into it and once you kind of let down your guard and let go of that, sort of the dogma behind that, I mean, almost every single one of these cases are also the sightings that people sort of experience, glowing orbs, the whole forest like just going like dead quiet, you know, which could link to infrasound, or it could link to sort of a more of a paranormal sort of, you know, metaphysical type thing. But it's wild. I mean, another thing too about this case, which is interesting, is
After these messages, we'll be right back.
You're listening to That Would Be Rad.
you know, once this case kind of came out, I think one of the paper kind of did their due diligence and it kind of asked some of the local natives of the area, because this was around like Mount St. Helens, and I don't know if you know, but I mean, Mount St. Helens is just
An active volcano.
well, it's an active volcano, but it has had sightings of lights, you know, all kinds of strange sort of paranormal phenomenon, you know, for years and years and years. And even the Spokane Indians around that area would say, you know, I mean, and again, this came out in 1924, so we're talking the natives from far, far, far back, even from then, would tell these stories of, you know, these, and this is another thing that I think is interesting, is they classified these quote unquote wild men as like, oh, well, they're just another Indian tribe. But they said, yeah, there was this other tribe of Indians that were covered in fur, and they would leave 18-inch tracks. So they were just giants, you know, and that's fascinating to me.
And just too, for everybody listening too, in case you think, well, I was going to say, in case you think Tyler is just like believe it all kind of person, he's about 99.9% that,
98.
but there's still like a percentage, like even when we were in the museum, there would be like a casting of, you know, like a Bigfoot that somebody found, and some of them would be like, that looks a little fake, you know?
Yeah.
So it is, I think sometimes it's a little much for me, some of the stuff. But I think the important thing, like we always kind of talk about, is it's a super rad way of looking at something that we've all kind of been, I mean, you know, rewind back to our childhood. We all saw Harry and the Hendersons, right? And you go back and you watch it, and it's like, man, you know, I made my kids watch it, and they thought it was hilarious. And, you know, we're accustomed to the legends and the stories, and it's just super interesting to think about. And like you said, you know, one of the first things that any of us do is we kind of try to use our own life experience, our own knowledge, to try to explain any kind of phenomenon.
Yeah,
right? I mean, anything, whether it's something that's miraculous that happens, you're in your mind going to try to rationalize how and why that happened. And the same is true for things like Bigfoot and all that. I always come back to the fact that, you know, going back to that episode that we talked about cryptids and like the cryptids 101 thing, And I think I sent you something over the weekend about this like deep sea fish, and it's just like this picture of it.
Oh,
because
yeah.
our technology keeps on getting better. Our ability to reach unreachable places keeps on getting better.
Yeah.
And the creatures that they're discovering, not just in the ocean, but just, outside in the wilderness, are just so fascinating. And so for people to completely write off the idea that there's stuff that exists out there that we haven't discovered yet is just a shame.
Yeah.
Man. You're kind of doing yourself a disservice. Anything else, I guess, that you want to... I mean, I think it's important to note, too, this area where the cabin was and stuff, I think I remember I read that, I want to say that the Mount St. Helens eruption in...
how it possibly could have destroyed...
Yeah, where that cabin is, and then that whole area kind of looks a lot different than it did back in 1924.
Well, also, once this came out in the news, the guys that were in the event never totally said exactly where it was at. So that's why you would have a ton of people out there, trying to find the cabin. And I think Fred Beck even said that, to his knowledge, nobody had found it yet. But the general area of like where they think Ape Canyon was, like you said, I think one of the eruptions sort of kind of destroyed where that cabin would have been.
So I looked at, it's March 27th, 1980. So right in our lifetime here. Well, that's a couple months before I was born, but
yeah, I think it's an interesting case. I think all the weird stuff is cool. There's a book that I'm probably going to buy us both a copy of. I mentioned the Strange Familiars podcast. A guy named Timothy Renner and another guy named Joshua Cutchin have written a book. It's two books, actually. It's 2 parts, but where the footprints end. It's just amazing. All these podcasts that I listen to, they kind of go into the more sort of, I guess, kind of esoteric side of Bigfoot or these kind of sightings. Man, lately in this past year, I feel like almost every single one I've listened to has referenced these books. So congrats on that, guys.
So what are the names of the books again? So it's part 1 and part 2? Or
yeah, I think there's 2 parts, and both of them are called Where the Footprints End. Okay. Because that's another sort of account, when you have these, sightings of Bigfoot, or they find these. I believe there was one in Canada or maybe northern U.S. where there was a huge snow and a guy had found almost like 150 feet worth of tracks. And keep in mind, this is like fresh snow, super deep. You're out in the middle of an area or like a trail or something. And then all of a sudden the footprints just completely end, which I don't know about you, but for me, that's not I don't care how advanced, an ape is, or I don't care if it is some sort of like caveman type thing. That's not something that they can pull off, So, so that's sort of where the title comes from, I presume. Yeah, Where the Footprints End. Joshua Cutchin, who is a great writer. He's written A Trojan Feast, A Brimstone Deceit. But anyway, he's a great writer. And then the Strange Familiars podcast host, Timothy Renner, he's the co-writer on this too. They both collaborated and made these books. So everything that I hear about it, it's, right up our alley. So cool. I think we'll probably read that, and then maybe we can do a deep dive, a full episode on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, we wanted to kind of treat this one as kind of like our entry point into kind of talking about that stuff a little bit more this year. And really, again, because it was just super fascinating from the second that I saw the kind of diorama or whatever you want to call it at the Bigfoot Museum.
Well, you got anything else, bro? I feel like we went down several rabbit trails.
No, man. I mean, I think that is a good way to kind of kickstart the conversation about Bigfoot. Yeah. And I'm interested to hear folks' thoughts about, what they think about Bigfoot. Do they think it's just a complete sham? Do they have any interest in encountering? Do they have any encounter stories?
Oh, yeah.
I'd love to hear about that as well.
Yeah, and also I think that if any of you guys out there, any of our listeners, if you have any topics that you want us to talk about. You know, we've had several and a lot of cool stuff that we plan on hitting. But, you know, if you know of, you know, some sort of paranormal encounter or, I mean, really anything that this podcast covers, feel free, because you may be into something that we've never heard of. And, yeah, we'd love to check it out. So
we need to start getting into the fantasy movies, man, that we talked about.
Oh man, are we gonna kick it off? We're gonna tell them about it. Oh, side note, a little bit of Be Kind Rewind. Clay, our loyal listener, I knew that I had made this mistake a long time ago when I was talking about the fantasy movie Fire and Ice. I said that it was a Frank Thorne film. It's actually Ralph Bakshi, which I knew about. Clay, I thank you for reminding me. Okay, let's get into it.
Yes, well, I'm just saying this. Next week, we're gonna pit two of those movies against each other. We'll announce what those two movies are on our Instagram, so you have to go there to figure that out and to find out what they are. Then individually, we're going to watch these fantasy movies and decide from those two which one kind of makes it on to the next round.
Oh,
essentially, what we're doing is we're building a bracket, much like the
sort of like Sweet 16.
Yeah, like the
sort of like March Madness, basically.
Yeah, March Madness, but with old 80s fantasy movies. Now, the criteria was, of course, that they had to be made in the 80s, which kind of, took out a couple of the potential competitors, like the movie Excalibur, because I think it came out in the 70s.
Oh, that's right.
But I recently got a copy of that on VHS, and
is it cool?
I'm pretty I haven't watched it yet, but I'm pretty excited to kind of get back into it, especially now that we're super into D&D. Don't worry, folks, we're not going to go into D&D today.
Oh, speaking of which, I was waiting to even tell you this. I actually rewatched The Last Unicorn on HBO Max the other day.
Yeah. Wait, that made it to our list?
I think it's on the list. Yeah, so I'll wait. I'll hold off. We'll talk about it.
Just wait, because I need to watch it too.
I will say this, though. There's a character called the Red Bull, and I'd never known this before.
Here we go.
I'd never known this, so I'm wondering if that's where Red Bull kind of gets its name and inspiration. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited because, look, in October, the whole month of October, in fact, I think I started in September, all I watched was like old 80s horror movies. Then towards the beginning of November, all the way through until like the end of Christmas, it was all Christmas movies. So now I'm like, okay, I need to take a break from all that stuff, and I want to get into, the fantasy movies and stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty excited.
Also, we're really into D&D again, and we got our next game. Well, when you hear this,
just in a couple of days,
this will have been the previous Saturday. So, yeah.
I think these people probably have other things that they need to get accomplished today.
Yeah.
So why don't we just say this? Why don't we say thank you guys so much for listening week after week, coming back, interacting with us on our Instagram page, which is at That Would Be Rad. And especially for those of you that have been buying our merchandise.
Yeah.
Holy moly. Man alive. I mean, boy howdy, it's just flying off the shelves. The good news is everything's still in stock. So if you are looking for a killer t-shirt, sweatshirt, did I say it right that time?
Or sweater, as Woody says in the last.
Or like a hoodie, a hat, whatever, we've got you taken care of, So, just thank you to everybody that has began to support the podcast in that way. Yeah,
and, as always, if you have anything to say to us, like what he said, That Would Be Rad on Instagram, shoot us a DM. Or if you have a more lengthy, topic you want to send us, feel free to email us at thatwouldberadpod@gmail.com. So we appreciate you. We thank you so much for coming back week after week. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. And so we love you. We appreciate you. And as always,
be rad.
That's the way it goes. once in a time where I just needed some sunshine. You were already dead, for you became a ghost. You always said our future would be a parade.